Ladies and gentlemen, life is suffering. That's an inescapable truth. And if you're facing hardship, if everything around you seems to be crumbling, it is very tempting to believe that you have been abandoned, that the suffering you endure is senseless. But that is not true. The pain you are experiencing is not arbitrary. It is a crucible, and crucibles are meant to refine, not to destroy. The weight that rests on your shoulders, the struggle that keeps you awake at night, is not there by accident. It is there because you are being prepared. Look at history. Look at the figures who shaped the world. They did not emerge from comfort. They were forged in the fire of adversity. They walked through darkness before they could bring light. And that is because suffering, if endured with meaning, is the single greatest force of transformation. And what does that mean for you? It means that you must not shrink in the face of difficulty. You must not curse your circumstances and assume that you are a victim of some cruel and indifferent universe. Instead, you must recognize that the hardship you face is shaping you into something far greater than you are now. Imagine for a moment the person you could become, the individual you would be if you fully accepted the responsibility placed upon you, if you endured with faith rather than despair, if you embraced the suffering as a necessary process of refinement rather than a senseless punishment. You might ask, why would God allow me to go through this? But the better question is, who will I become because of this? Because when you take on suffering voluntarily, when you face it head on and refuse to break under its weight, you become someone capable of carrying even greater responsibility. Someone who can withstand even deeper challenges and emerge not bitter, but wise. And that is the essence of preparation. It is painful, it is uncertain, it does not come with an instruction manual or an easy escape, but it is shaping you, it is equipping you for a role, a purpose, a mission that you cannot yet fully comprehend. So what do? You stand up straight, you bear your burden with dignity, you move forward step by step, understanding that you are not being crushed, you are being transformed, you are not being abandoned, you are being prepared. And if you trust that process, if you take responsibility for it, then you will emerge stronger, wiser, and ready for what is to come. Because God does not waste suffering, He uses it to shape those who are willing to rise. Suffering is not merely an unfortunate byproduct of life, it is the very forge in which character is formed. If you observe the structure of existence itself, you'll notice that every meaningful transformation, every moment of genuine progress comes through struggle. It's an immutable principle woven into the very fabric of reality. You don't develop resilience without hardship. You don't cultivate wisdom without encountering chaos. You don't acquire strength without first confronting your own weakness. And so suffering is not simply something to be avoided, it is something to be understood, engaged with, and ultimately mastered. When people encounter suffering, the default reaction is resistance. They curse their misfortune. They rail against the injustice of it. They attempt to extricate themselves from the pain as quickly as possible. But suffering does not care about your resistance. It does not retreat because you refuse to acknowledge it. Instead, it presses in, demanding either your submission or your transformation. And it is here that the defining choice is made. Do you allow the suffering to break you, to erode your spirit, to convince you of your own helplessness? Or do you stand within the storm, allowing it to carve away the lesser parts of you, refining you into something stronger? Look at those who have truly shaped the world, and you will find that their greatness was never born of comfort. Comfort dulls the edges of ambition. It lulls you into stagnation. It tempts you with ease while stripping you of necessity. But necessity is the mother of growth, and nothing creates necessity like suffering. It is in suffering that a person realizes what they are truly made of. It is in suffering that illusions about one's own strength or capability are stripped away, revealing the raw, unfiltered truth of who you actually are. And if you can endure that truth, if you can face it without turning away, then you will emerge from suffering as something greater than you were before. But this does not happen automatically. Suffering is not inherently transformational. It can just as easily destroy as it can build. The determining factor is how you respond to it. If you collapse under its weight, if you allow it to convince you that life is meaningless, that your efforts are futile, then it will consume you. It will turn you bitter, resentful. It will convince you that you are a victim of an indifferent universe, that there is no reason to strive, no purpose in perseverance. And once you accept that mindset, suffering wins. It becomes not a forge, but a tomb. Yet, if you recognize suffering for what it truly is, a test, a challenge, a necessary step in your own development, then you can endure it with purpose. You can choose to engage with it, to extract meaning from it, to allow it to shape you into someone capable of bearing even greater burdens. And that is the key, responsibility. When suffering comes, and it will come, you must take responsibility for it. Not in the sense that you blame yourself for everything that happens, but in the sense that you acknowledge your power to respond. You do not control what happens to you, but you absolutely control how you meet it. You control whether you collapse or whether you rise. You control whether you surrender or whether you fight. And in that choice lies everything. Consider for a moment the idea that suffering is not an obstacle to growth, but the very mechanism of it. If you were never tested, never challenged, never placed in situations that forced you to stretch beyond what you previously believed possible, then you would remain weak, you would remain naive, you would remain unprepared for the weight of existence itself. And life does not allow that. Life will throw suffering at you, not because it is cruel, but because it is necessary, because it is through suffering that you develop the strength to bear the responsibility that life demands. And responsibility is everything. It is what gives life meaning. It is what transforms suffering from something senseless into something profound. When you choose to carry your burden, to meet suffering with courage rather than despair, you transform it. You take what could have been purely destructive and you mold it into something constructive. You become someone capable of not just enduring, but of leading, not just surviving, but thriving. And in that transformation, you find purpose. There is an ancient idea that the strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire. This is not a metaphor, it is a fundamental truth. The process of forging requires extreme heat, pressure, and force. Without those elements, the metal remains weak. It lacks integrity. It is brittle and useless. But when subjected to fire and shaped under pressure, it becomes something unbreakable. And human beings are no different. The fire you endure, the suffering you face, is not designed to destroy you. It is designed to forge you into something indestructible. So when suffering comes, do not turn away. Do not seek the easy escape. Do not resent the hardship as though it were a mistake. Instead, recognize it as the process by which you are being strengthened. Recognize that it is in suffering that you are given the opportunity to become someone worthy of the responsibility placed upon you. Stand in the fire, endure the pressure, and know that you are not being punished, you are being prepared. Chaos is the natural state of the world. It is the raw, unstructured potential that exists before form and meaning are imposed upon it. And the fundamental task of every individual, of every being that strives for order, is to confront that chaos and transform it into something structured, something meaningful, something stable. This process is not just a philosophical idea, it is an existential reality, a psychological necessity, and an unavoidable responsibility. The suffering you experience, the confusion you endure, the uncertainty that gnaws at the edges of your mind, these are all manifestations of chaos, and how you respond to them determines whether you descend into disorder or rise into something greater. At the core of this process is the recognition that chaos is neither good nor evil, it simply is. It is the unknown, the unpredictable, the force that disrupts and dismantles. It is present in every moment of transformation, in every crisis, in every major transition in life. When you lose a job, when a relationship collapses, when illness strikes, when the future becomes uncertain, You are plunged into chaos. And in that moment, you have a choice. You can allow the chaos to consume you, to drag you into despair, to convince you that there is no structure, no meaning, no purpose. Or you can engage with it. You can face it voluntarily. You can begin the arduous process of imposing order on that which threatens to undo you. This is not an easy task, nor is it one that can be accomplished without suffering. The transition from chaos to order requires struggle. It requires endurance. It requires the willingness to look directly into the abyss, to acknowledge the full magnitude of the disorder you are facing, and to take responsibility for shaping it into something meaningful. And this is not just a psychological battle. It is the foundation of all civilization. Every great human achievement, every scientific breakthrough, every social structure, every moral framework, these are all manifestations of order that emerged from chaos. But this does not mean that order is static or that chaos is permanently banished. Life is not a single battle between order and disorder. It is an ongoing war, one that must be fought constantly. Even when you have imposed some structure on your life, even when you have achieved stability, the forces of chaos remain just beyond the edges of that stability, waiting for an opportunity to reassert themselves. You, and they will, no structure remains intact forever. No system, no belief, no routine is immune to disruption. This is why growth is necessary. This is why stagnation is dangerous. If you do not continually impose order, chaos will inevitably return. The ancient myths understood this truth deeply. In many traditions, chaos is represented as a dragon, a monstrous force that threatens to consume everything in its path. And the hero, the one who seeks meaning and purpose, must confront this dragon, must face it directly, must enter the unknown and wrest from it something valuable. This is not a one-time event. It is a lifelong process. Every time you encounter a problem that seems insurmountable, every time you face suffering that appears meaningless, every time you are confronted with the reality of your own limitations, you are staring into the face of chaos, and your response determines whether you remain lost in disorder or whether you emerge stronger, wiser, and more capable. This is why responsibility is crucial. Chaos does not resolve itself. It does not retreat simply because you wish it would. If you ignore it, if you refuse to confront it, it only grows stronger. It expands, taking over more and more of your life until you are completely overwhelmed. This is why small problems must be dealt with before they become large ones. It is why discipline, structure, and intentionality are necessary. This is why most decisions made good sense, which is the usual way to think about the universe or something bigger than you. You do not defeat chaos by avoiding it. You defeat it by engaging with it, by identifying its source, by taking action, however small, to impose order upon it. But there is something else to consider. Chaos is not merely a threat. It is also the source of possibility. If the world were pure order, if everything were already structured, predictable, and complete, there would be no room for growth. There would be no potential, no opportunity for transformation. It is precisely because chaos exists that change is possible. It is because there is disorder that new structures can emerge. If This perspective is not easy to adopt, especially when you are in the depths of chaos, when you are overwhelmed by suffering and uncertainty. But if you can hold on to it, if you can recognize that the pain you feel is not just destructive, but also transformative, then you can begin to act differently. You can begin to see that your struggles are not meaningless, that they are instead opportunities to impose order on your own existence. And the more you do this, the stronger you become. The more you take responsibility for the chaos in your life, the more capable you are of shaping it into something meaningful. And this is what it means to be truly prepared for life. It is not about avoiding chaos. It is about mastering it. It is about developing the strength to face the unknown without flinching, to engage with disorder without succumbing to it, to extract meaning from suffering rather than being crushed by it. Because the alternative is far worse. If you refuse to confront chaos, if you allow it to fester, it will consume you. It will drag you into bitterness, despair, and resentment. But if you choose to take responsibility, if you choose to face the unknown with courage, then you become something more. You become someone capable of turning suffering into wisdom, of transforming disorder into structure, of creating meaning where none existed before. And that is the path forward. That is the process of growth. That is the reality of existence. Chaos is inevitable, but so is your ability to shape it. Life is burdened. That is an inescapable truth. Every human being is given a weight to carry, whether they choose to acknowledge it or not. Some try to ignore it, to reject responsibility, to cast off the very thing that gives life its meaning. But this is a mistake, because the burden is not merely an obstacle, it is the very thing that shapes you. The weight you carry, the struggles you endure, the responsibilities you assume, these are not punishments. They are the necessary conditions for growth. Without burden, there is no strength. Without responsibility, there is no purpose. Without suffering, there is no transformation. It is tempting to believe that life should be easy, that happiness comes from freedom, from responsibility, from the absence of suffering, from the ability to do whatever you want without consequence. But this is not true. A person who refuses to carry their burden does not become free. They become weak, they become lost, they become resentful, bitter, nihilistic. Because without a burden to carry, there is nothing to strive toward, nothing to build, nothing to overcome. And human beings are wired for struggle. We are not designed for comfort. We are designed for challenge. The moment we stop striving, we begin to deteriorate. The moment we reject responsibility, we invite chaos into our lives. Look at history, at the great figures who shaped the world. They did not seek an easy life. They took on immense responsibility. They bore the weight of their circumstances, their people, their time, and in doing so, they became something more than they were. They understood a fundamental truth. The heavier the burden, the stronger you become. If you choose to carry nothing, you remain weak. If you take on more than you believe you can bear, you discover that you are far more capable than you imagined. Growth does not come from ease. It comes from voluntarily accepting suffering and transforming it into something meaningful. This is not to say that all suffering is good or that every burden is justified. There are burdens that crush, that break people, that destroy lives. But even then, the response matters. Even in the face of suffering beyond your control, there is a choice: to collapse under its weight or to rise despite it. And that choice is what defines a person. The world is full of people who have suffered unimaginable hardships, yet emerged from them with wisdom, strength, and resilience. It is also full of people who have allowed suffering to destroy them, to turn them into something bitter and broken. The difference is not in the suffering itself, but in the way it is carried. And this is where responsibility becomes essential. Responsibility is not just about duty or obligation, it is about meaning. A person without responsibility has no direction, no aim, no sense of purpose. They drift, unmoored, at the mercy of their impulses and desires. But when a person assumes responsibility, when they voluntarily take on a burden, they begin to forge themselves into something stronger. They become someone capable of bearing more, of achieving more, of contributing something valuable to the world. And this is not just a philosophical idea, it is a psychological necessity. People who lack responsibility suffer more. They experience more anxiety, more depression, more despair because they have nothing anchoring them. They have nothing to hold on to when chaos comes, and chaos always comes. It is not enough to simply exist. You must strive. You must take on a burden that is meaningful enough to justify the suffering of life. And this is a deeply personal process. The burden you choose must be something that challenges you, that forces you to grow, that pushes you beyond your current limitations. It cannot be something imposed on you by others, something you resent or reject. It must be something you accept willingly, something you recognize as necessary. And once you accept it, once you commit to carrying it, you will begin to change. You will become stronger, more disciplined, more capable of facing the inevitable difficulties of existence. There's a reason why the strongest people are often those who have suffered the most. They have learned to bear the weight of their suffering rather than allowing it to crush them. They have chosen responsibility over victimhood, purpose over despair, meaning over nihilism. They have recognized that life is not about avoiding suffering, but about confronting it with courage. And in doing so, they have found something deeper than comfort or ease. They have found fulfillment. This is the paradox of responsibility. The more burden you willingly take on, the freer you become. A person who rejects responsibility becomes enslaved to their own weaknesses, their own fears, their own lack of direction. But a person who takes on responsibility, who accepts the suffering that comes with it, becomes stronger, more disciplined, more capable of shaping their own destiny. This is not a simple or easy path. It requires sacrifice, effort, endurance, but it is the only path that leads to something truly meaningful. So the question is not whether you will suffer. That is inevitable. The question is whether you will allow that suffering to shape you into something stronger, or whether you will let it destroy you. Will you take on the burden that life offers? Will you accept the weight of responsibility? Will you strive towards something greater? Or will you retreat into resentment and despair, blaming the world for your suffering rather than transforming it into something meaningful? The choice is yours, but understand this. The burden is not there to crush you. It is there to prepare you. It is there to teach you what you are capable of, to push you beyond your limitations, to force you to grow into something greater than you are now. And if you accept it, if you take on responsibility willingly, if you bear the weight with dignity and purpose, then you will become someone who can endure anything. Someone who can face the chaos of life without flinching. Someone who does not shrink from suffering, but rises in the face of it. And that is what it means to truly live. Pain is an unavoidable aspect of existence. To be alive is to experience suffering, whether physical, emotional, or psychological. It is woven into the fabric of reality itself. No one is exempt from it, and no amount of avoidance or denial can make it disappear. But pain is not merely something to be endured, it is something to be integrated, something that can be transformed into a force of growth rather than a source of destruction. The way you respond to pain determines whether it will cripple you or strengthen you. And this is not a trivial distinction. It is the fundamental difference between a life of meaning and a life of despair. Pain has a voice. It speaks in the language of necessity. It tells you what is wrong, what must be confronted, what must be changed. It is not simply an arbitrary form of suffering. It is information. When you feel physical pain, your body is alerting you to damage, to weakness, to something that requires attention. When you feel emotional pain, it is a signal that something in your psychological or social environment is not as it should be. Pain forces you to confront reality. It strips away illusion, shatters complacency, and demands action. And if you listen to it, if you engage with it rather than seeking to silence it, you can extract from it something invaluable, wisdom. But most people do not listen to pain. They seek to numb it, to distract themselves, to push it away. They use substances, entertainment, avoidance tactics, anything to keep from feeling it fully. And while this may provide temporary relief, it does not address the underlying cause. Ignoring pain does not make it disappear. It makes it grow. The more you suppress it, the more power it gains. The more you turn away from it, the more control it exerts over you. Pain that is not confronted does not remain static. It festers, it deepens into suffering, into resentment, into bitterness. And a person consumed by unresolved pain becomes dangerous to themselves and to those around them. The only way to master pain is to face it directly. This does not mean seeking it out needlessly or embracing suffering for its own sake. It means acknowledging that pain carries within it the seeds of transformation. If you engage with your pain, if you dissect it, understand it, explore its origins and implications, you will find that it has something to teach you. It reveals your limitations, your weaknesses, the areas in which you must grow. It forces you to acknowledge difficult truths, to accept aspects of reality you might prefer to ignore, and in doing so, it provides the raw material for personal evolution. Pain also serves another function. It reveals what you truly value. If something causes you pain, it is because on some level it matters to you. People do not suffer over things that are meaningless to them. Heartbreak, failure, loss. These experiences are painful precisely because they are connected to something deeply significant. If you lose someone you love, the pain is proportional to the depth of that love. If you fail at something important, the pain reflects the value you placed on that goal. In this sense, pain is not your enemy, it is your guide. It shows you where your priorities lie. It clarifies what is most essential to you. And once you understand this, you can use pain as a compass, directing you toward the things that matter most, rather than allowing it to paralyze you in fear and avoidance.